everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. We have our two speakers today, Chris and Kelsie. So our first speaker is Chris, and he is a postgraduate from in software development, working at Planet.js as a senior software engineer. So I hand over to Chris right now.
Thanks, Dana. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for having me. So my name's Chris. I am a senior engineer at Planet.js here in Glasgow. Tonight I'm hoping to talk to you about automating API governance or some part of that process using a tool called Spectral CLI. So maybe start with that term, API governance. And it's a bit ill-defined, you know, it feels like a kind of an emerging field right now. And as, you know, with something like that, it's become a bit distorted as it's become more widely adopted, a victim of semantic diffusion. You can probably think of a few examples of this yourself, things like microservices, RESTful APIs, AI, you know, they kind of, once they go out into the market, they end up getting a wee bit distorted as a definition. So we'll try and pin it down a wee bit. For this evening's talk, we're going to talk primarily about HTTP APIs, so apologies to those of you in the GraphQL or gRPC worlds. But I do think some of the same principles will apply, and there are equivalent tools out there too. So let's start by, you know, pinning down exactly what we mean by API governance. And I like this definition from Postman, in which they say, API governance is the practice of defining policies and processes that foster effective collaboration, promote API consistency, and enable organizations to get the most value out of their API portfolio. And for me, I think these are the key words and what I'd like to focus on specifically. So policies and processes, collaboration, and consistency. And I think the tool we're going to talk about tonight, Spectral, really helps you build value in each of these areas. So I'm hoping you're going to leave tonight armed with a tool that you can take back to your day job and improve your APIs in these areas. First of all, consistency. So by that, I mean ensuring consumers can rely upon known standards and conventions when they interact with your APIs. You know from your own experience, if you're building a bunch of APIs or using a bunch of APIs on the same platform, they should look and feel the same. Next up, quality. So a bit vague, but really what I mean by that is there are established industry standards in areas like security and documentation that you can adhere to that will make your APIs more coherent, more reliable, and easier to use. So if we can, let's leverage those. And then finally, collaboration. Oh, sorry. So jump in here. Yeah, collaboration, okay. So the first two, they sound pretty straightforward, right? Who wouldn't want their APIs to be consistent and of decent quality? But how do you do that in a real world when quite often you're building APIs in a big organization, you might be working in a team that's geographically dispersed, perhaps you've got multiple teams building multiple APIs as part of a larger suite. So we're going to discuss how to make collaboration on your APIs a bit more straightforward. And I think those qualities that we're looking to achieve, there's a really good example, actually not far from here, of what can go wrong when you miss out on these. So we'll get to that. Okay, does anyone drive here tonight? Yeah, did you drive past these? Yeah, does anyone know what they're called? Ski jump. Ski jump, brilliant, awesome. Who said that, sorry? Missed that. Great, thank you. Awesome, yeah, ski jumps. So yeah, I've always heard them referred to as the ski jumps because they're like two bits of motorway that just end abruptly and they've got a wee bit of an incline, and so yeah, they look like ski jumps really. And you can see they're just nearby, right? They're just at the bottom of the M8. Yeah, I walked past them actually. I got off at West, so yeah, right here. So you're probably thinking like why, right? What are they for? Well, originally the plan for Glasgow's motorways was to be a ring road, right the way round the city, and it would have come off the ski ramps, gone through like Lauriston. It would have torn up Glasgow Green, and it would have made High Street into a motorway, and it connected up at Townhead eventually there. But of course, it never happened, right? But at the same time, that plan was hatched in like the 70s. It wasn't until the 90s it was officially cancelled. So you had signage all around Glasgow referring to a ring road that never existed. And we were left with these like ghost roads. There's another one up at St George's Cross that kind of comes up, and that was going to be a motorway up to Mary Hill. And for the longest time, there was this platform across the M8 that is now Tay House, I think it's called, or it's an office block. But I think it was for like almost a decade, that was empty, and everyone referred to it as the bridge to nowhere, because it was never meant to be a bridge. But anyway, so why am I talking about motorways? Well, I think some of the same principles apply to API governance. It's hard building motorways, and mistakes early in the design process in your specification can be costly. And I think the unfinished structures that we see around Glasgow every day are a reminder of that. In our world, in APIs, to bring it back to APIs, we don't want consumers of our APIs working to the wrong specifications either. Their time's expensive, and we know ourselves as consumers that if something doesn't work or isn't as described, it's a really frustrating experience. It can put you off an entire integration with a third party or whatever. So that brings us to OpenAPI, which is the design language for HTTP APIs. For anyone who's unfamiliar, OpenAPI is basically an interface that describes what your API does and how to interact with it. It has zero concern for implementation, so it could be describing a Node application, a .NET application. It doesn't care where it's hosted, on-premise, in the cloud. It's just a guide to what your API does and how to interact with it. Sorry, pardon me. It can be created in either JSON or YAML. See YAML there. And it typically describes elements like endpoints, how to authorize, schemas for your response objects, your request objects, tags, much more. In terms of how to generate an OpenAPI specification, there's typically two methods. Design first, in which the specification can be created ahead of time, and then you create your implementation to match the specification. Or code first, and there's a bunch of tools that you would annotate your codes to the extent that you can generate the OpenAPI specification off the back of that. How it's created isn't really a concern for us just now, and I think that decision really comes down to like the topology of your team and your organization. Do you have someone capable of writing them? Do you know ahead of time? But basically, you should end up with a good specification in either way. Just about finding what fits you and your team best. Oh, sorry. Okay. A wee sneak peek. So the OpenAPI specification is, we said, the interface between consumers and your API. And if you're using any kind of like modern API gateway product, something like AWS Gateway, Azure APIM, Tyke, It's even like the artifact that's deployed to those. So it becomes like a real artifact as well. So it's incredibly important. But it's not the only place where it's important, because there's a really good ecosystem of tools for building upon and extending your OpenAPI spec to create other products. Like maybe you want to build an SDK using something like Fern. You can do that directly from your OpenAPI specification. You maybe want to create a doc site. You could use something like Redocly for that. And typically when you're building APIs, you're going to be liaising with business partners, other internal teams. Ideally, you want to be working with the consumers of your API from the outset, so that as you build the implementation, they can build their integration in tandem. So you might be creating things like mock servers from your OpenAPI spec as well. But I think what I'm really trying to impress here is that this becomes like a source of truth for all of these products. And a mistake here shows up not just for your consumers of your API, but the people using your SDK, the devs going to your dev site, and the people you're working alongside. So you really want to make sure you get it right. To put a more positive spin on it, if you can ensure your OpenAPI spec is consistent, extensive, reliable, it improves every single one of these products. So I think it's really important. And it's maybe, I think sometimes OpenAPI is a bit like as close as you can get to documentation without being documentation at times. So it's not the most flashy or whatever, but these things are so impactful, right? Having these correct, extensive, and right is really, really impactful for the people you're working alongside. So hopefully, again, impressed upon you that I think it's super important, OpenAPI specs. So let's see how we can automate some improvements in these areas. And that brings us to the tool I was going to talk about tonight, which is Spectral. Spectral is a linter, really, a linter of JSON or YAML. You guys, I'm sure, will be familiar with linting tools from the JavaScript world, like ESLint. Think of this as the equivalent for OpenAPI specifications. It does also work with async API as well, I should say. And it uses some of the same technology under the hood as well. It uses JSON schema, JSON path. It's an open source tool from a company called Stoplight. They do have a paid-for platform that you can use as well. But it's available as either a CLI, and there's also a JavaScript API for it too. So it's super lightweight and ready to be baked into either your local development workflow or a CI/CD pipeline. There's three kind of core concepts to Spectral. First up is rules. Rules are specific designs for what you want a given element to do. Functions are how we implement those rules. There's built-in functions from Spectral, and you can also extend that with JavaScript. And finally, rule sets. And rule sets are really containers for a group of rules and functions. And that's where I think Spectral is really powerful, because those rule sets become basically API style guides. I don't know if anyone's ever worked with an API style guide in the past. My experience before Spectral was it was a Word doc. Maybe if you're lucky, it was a Confluence page. The person who wrote it might still be at the company, probably not. There might be one version, there's probably many. And it was never a tool for driving quality. It was just a thing that existed. The only time I've ever really seen it wheeled out was in snippy PR comments or something like that. It didn't bake any quality into your processes. So that's why I'm really keen on Spectral. Because with Spectral, your rule sets become a style guide, and you can bake them into your different workflows. So bear with me, I'm going to now jump into a wee demo. Let's come out here. Okay. We have to make that a bit bigger, eh? Okay. So we've got an OpenAPI specification here. For some reason, like the canonical like hello world or tutorial thing for OpenAPI is pet shops. So this is the Springfield Pet Shop API. And if we look at this here, let me see if I can get this to work. You can see it renders, it's valid. And sometimes I should say, actually, as we go through step by step through the different stages here, at every point, the OpenAPI specification is valid. Whether it's consistent, of a sufficient quality is another question. Would you want it to be the artifact that's deployed to the AWS gateway that's customer facing? I don't think so. So that's certainly the case here. You can see we've got no grouping of our endpoints, no descriptions, no authorization, no contact info. So let's see if we can use Spectral to improve upon that. Now, you install Spectral from npm. Obviously, I've got it installed already. You can see we're on version 6.11.1. And the convention for Spectral files is to use .spectral.yaml. So more YAML. And we're just going to start by saying, give me the basic rule set from Spectral for OpenAPI. Okay. And so if I've created my Spectral file, just check I'm in the right place. And it's as easy as just saying Spectral. This is not going to work now, I've said that. There we go. And you can see straight away, just the basic rule set has highlighted 48 problems. If I can talk through the output here, it gives us a line number followed by the severity. The severity can be one of 5 states. It can be error, in which it will return an exit code of 1, so it would fail a pipeline. Warning, info, hint, or off. And off obviously wouldn't show up here. Then we see next up, this is the rule. So the rule that's been violated. Description, so something a bit more meaningful for us to work with. And then finally the JSON path where the rule has been violated. And you can click on these and it will take you to the line in your OpenAPI spec, so just ready to fix it. So yeah, let's say we have fixed that then. And instead we'll jump in here. Okay. So I've fixed most of the rules here, and you can see already this is looking a lot better, right? We can see a meaningful version number, contact information, the server where we should go for this, the authorization scheme. Our endpoints have, oh, pardon me, still going. Our endpoints have descriptions, they're grouped by tag. So already much easier for our customers to work with. Now if I run Spectral again, you'll see that I fixed most of the issues, but not all. So there's still 3 here that we've decided not to fix. And if I close that. Now, you don't have to take every rule that you extend from. And it's usually quite useful, that functionality, especially when you're working with those like API management cloud providers, because they have their own idiosyncrasies that, maybe, I think one that I come across quite often is, asking for rate limits in your backend APIs when the rate limit's actually been set on the gateway itself. So in that case, I would want to override that rule and not get the warnings, not get the failed builds because of it, because it doesn't matter to me. So we'll do that here. And the rule is OES 3 unused component. And you can see I can, oh sorry, indentation. I'm going to change this to info, rerun spectral, and you can see the severity's changed there. And in fact, I just want to turn it off. And the same thing goes for, oh, of course, yeah, of course. Is that better? Apologies. So yeah, let's see, we've turned that, have I saved that? No. There we go. Turned it off entirely. So yeah, quite useful for inheriting from different rule sets. Now, if you look at the OpenAPI spec, you'll see that it is, again, valid, but would we want to deploy it? Well, I've noticed here that the contact information is wrong, right? It's going to the Shelbyville pet shop rather than the Springfield pet shop. So again, valid OpenAPI, but you wouldn't want this going in front of your customers, of course. So what we can do is create a custom rule in Spectral to guard for that kind of thing. And this is where custom rules are really effective because, you know, these inherited rule sets don't know your business logic, but with custom rules you can write things that you know you need to implement in your organization. So if you'll excuse me, I've got a wee snippet here. I'm going to across. Okay. Looks okay. And if I can just talk a little bit about this. You can see the rule name here. So we've said contact email domain is springfield.com. We've got a description. We've got the two required properties really are given and then. So given the JSON path to the property that we want to interrogate, and then tells us the function you want to run on the given property. In this instance, I'm using the built-in pattern function, which is essentially regex. The suite of built-in functions in Spectral was great. I very rarely have had to create a custom function. If you do, you can use plain JavaScript. There's a TypeScript interface to implement as well. So yeah, it's, I would say the built-in functions are quite extensive. And you can see we've sort of got our message, so what will show in the output, and we're going to say it's an error. So if I run it again here, you can see we're now getting our custom error. Now, if I jump in here, say, pardon me, change that to Springfield, rerun, and we're okay. So that's custom rules. I mentioned earlier about trying to leverage some existing standards that are already out there. And with Spectral, I feel like that comes in the form of the existing rule sets that you can inherit from. There's a really good community of open source rule sets that you can leverage. There's quite a few big companies using Spectral that have shared their rule sets. There's rule sets for the different cloud providers as well and their gateway products. Two that I like to use are in security and documentation. So you just take those, you install those via npm. Hopefully this doesn't take too long. And let me just drop those in there. And so yeah, you can inherit from multiple rule sets. There we go. So we're now inheriting from the Spectral OWASP rule set. So it will compare your OpenAPI specification with the OWASP security top 10. There's different versions of that for different years as well. And then the spectral documentation rule set, really important if you're using your OpenAPI to create a docs site especially. It just makes sure your documentation's extensive and accurate. So you can see we've inherited from those. So let's rerun. Oops, sorry, I'm rerun. There you go. So we've now got quite a few problems. So you can see how we started off with an OpenAPI specification that was valid, could have been deployed, but in reality it has plenty of problems, plenty of errors. Now, you might not want to fix every one of those. That's why the ability to change the severity is so important. But they at least merit a discussion. So you can bake that into your code reviews, pull requests, whatever, any sort of regular design discussion that you have might be a good place to discuss these rules and their severity. And I should say we're using an NPM package for these right now, but you can also put URLs in here too, which is super powerful because what we have in effect is pretty sparse, but we have a style guide now for the Springfield Pet Shop. And if a new development team was to join our company, we could put this at a URL, share it with them, and then they can inherit from it. So a really, really good bit of functionality there. Now, back to the slides, that's all right. Oh no, yeah, sorry. Get to see some of those memes again. There you go. There we go, okay. So yeah, as I mentioned, I think some of the issues that we're kind of identifying there and solving, they're not the most complex, and in the past they would have been picked up in maybe like a pull request or a code review, but I just think, you know, why bother with that cognitive load, right? Automate it. You know, that stuff's boring, I think, right? Whether the paths are right, whether the query params are right. If you can bake it into a workflow, it never even makes it to a pull request, it never makes it into a code review. So to refer back to the ways we can generate OpenAPI specifications, if you're going down the design first route, there's a really good VS Code extension for Spectral that will give you immediate feedback in VS Code. There's also Stoplight Studio, which is a paid-for product from the creators of Spectral. I can't speak to its quality, I've never used it. If you're going down the code first route, and this is what I've got most experience in, it's introduced it as a post-build step. So generate a static OpenAPI document every time you build and lint it. It's dead quick, and it saves you time in the end. Or I've seen other people use a tool like Husky or something to create a Git hook. So before you commit, lint your OpenAPI specifications in. I think the most effective place for it to live is in your CI/CD pipelines as a quality gate. As I mentioned, especially if you are wanting to ensure you're not pushing out a valid but not good OpenAPI specification to your consumers. And it's a really powerful way to work collaboratively as well. You know, you can share either a pipeline template with other teams or have their OpenAPI specs come through your pipeline. Yeah, really important. So hopefully I've demonstrated there's some value in linting your OpenAPI specs before it reaches your customers. I think you can take an OpenAPI spec that's simply valid and make it useful. It's a tool for building consistency. You know, there's so many decisions you have to make when building APIs, but you know, make them once, build a rule for it, and automate it going forward. Don't have the discussion every single time you build a new endpoint, or because you know it bogs you down. For quality, you know, build a style guide. you can leverage existing rule sets that are out there. Even just starting with that core rule set is a step forward. And then in terms of collaboration, I think if you're working in a bigger organization, they're dead easy to share. You can just stick them on a URL. You can create your own packages as well. And the fact that you can override rules individually means they're quite easy to adopt incrementally. You don't have to do a big bang and break everyone's build straight away. So that's it for Spectral and linting. You know, we're talking about automating API governance, and I think the kind of next steps off the back of that, if you're interested, would be to look at things like diffing, so checking the scope of changes in your specs against a deployed site, and then contract testing as well. So you know, checking that the implementation does what the OpenAPI spec says it does. It's really important too. Some links here to Spectral, GitHub, Stoplight, the company. APIs You Won't Hate is a really good blog. That's what I found out at Spectral, so put that on there. And if you've learned nothing else tonight, you know those are called the ski jumps now. So thanks for your time.
If you wish to have any questions, Victoria is here.
Oh, okay. Hello. Hi, livestream. Hi. So we use Spectral at my work, and we think it's like pretty neat and stuff. But one thing we have an issue with is performance, especially on specs that are like big. Have you run into the similar issues?
I haven't. I'm fortunate enough that I'm working on a greenfield project right now. So I think right now the linting process takes 6 seconds for us. But it does take time to in the pipeline to. I think I showed like a green check from a pipeline, which is purely the linting step. You're quite right though. I have to install the packages first, right? Because we're using like ephemeral agents, so we have to go and install Spectral, install the security package, the documentation package. I couldn't tell you exactly how long that takes, but that would build up, I think, over time. We considered just taking a straight copy of those packages for the reason that we just didn't want stuff changing from underneath us. And like I said, we were using these ephemeral agents that would install fresh every time. So, but no, fortunate enough that I haven't come across. How long has it taken for you, then?
Okay, for a spec that's 60,000 lines, it's an hour and a half.
An hour and a half? Right.
Because Spectral, so for context,
Yeah.
Spectral runs rule by rule, and it goes through the spec every time. Play with it and put console.logs, you'll have a great time.
Yeah.
But like, it's because of that, it just takes quite a lot of time.
Okay. No, we're certainly working at a different scale. So.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I do actually use Spectral at work, but just to, at a very high level, just kind of lint that it's kind of passing kind of OpenAPI 3.1 rather than any like specific rules. You gave a particular example of a specific rule, and obviously it's quite a toy example, which was just the contact email. What kinds of rules would people actually use in practice to constrain endpoint, you know, so the way they specify endpoints in your experience?
Yeah, so I use that very rule actually. We use that.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's not nothing, but yeah.
But no, the ones that get violated the most, I would say, for us are like the casing.
Okay.
So like kebab case that we enforce, something like that. Then camel case on our camel case on our query params for that too. Where the version is specified in the path. Yeah, I would say those are probably the most violated I would say, and most effective from my experience.
Thank you.
No worries. No.
Any more questions? No.
Thanks for that, Chris. Is there any, when I use ESLint on my view file, if I write something that's out of sync and I save it, it's just going to correct it straight back into place, you know, the format on save. Is there anything like that that this kind of tool gives you, or like any kind of way to automate it so that I don't have to run Spectral in order to see the errors? It can kind of live detect that I'm writing bad spec.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. So if you're doing design first and you're working in VS Code, then using the extension would give you feedback immediately in the file, in your OpenAPI file. Yeah, so that's probably as close as it gets to that, I think, really. For most of my experience using it, though, has been code first generation. So building like a .NET API with all your annotations, a little big config file, and then it generates a static file that Spectral lints in a post-build step. So unfortunately, it can't come back and change any of the .NET code, but it can absolutely give you like real-time feedback in VS Code for the design-first workflow.
Thank you so much for your questions, and thank you so much, Chris, for an insightful presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you, Scotland.js, for sponsoring our live stream, and Barclays Eagle Labs for hosting us. And now we can have a break for 5 minutes, and then we can come for the second speaker.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming back. And now we have Kelsie. He is a front-end developer, and he's going to give us some insightful things on eco-friendly softwares so that it can help toward the environment as well. Thank you.
Okay, hello. First of all, can everybody up at the back hear my voice? I want to make sure I'm not either screaming in your ears or barely hearing me. So that's good. So today, my talk is about sustainable software engineering. And I've put a little section below just kind of describing that it's more the eco-friendly version of sustainability rather than the other way, which is just, last a very long time. So I've done this talk for my company before, but I've never done it to a group like yourselves. So this will be interesting. Bear with me. So I don't have slides for this. I actually have a website that I put together for it. So if we lose internet, it's game over, okay? So yeah, so sustainable software engineering, just emitting fewer greenhouse gases, being efficient with the energy we use, whether that's the data centers we choose to use, whether that's the hosting provider we use for our personal projects. All these things can factor into it, okay? But before that, let's talk briefly about me. And I'm gonna have to do a little bit of Command plus to zoom in a little bit for the folks up at the back. So there's my little face up at the top with a flower in my ear. If you find me on LinkedIn, it's the same picture with a flower in my ear. So I don't come from a stereotypical software engineering background. I studied a music degree for 4 years after school at University of Aberdeen. The plan was to become a music teacher. That's not the case now, as you can probably guess. Maybe like 2019 or so, I decided that teaching probably wasn't for me. So let's just apply to work in a shop. Apple was very nice to let me work for them, which was really cool because I got to teach kids how to use iPads and got my very first sort of taste in coding, which was teaching Swift UI to kids, literally like the basicest of for loops to play a game. It was very fun. If you're ever bored, go to an Apple store and try out their creative sessions. I recommend. So that's what I did then. And then after that, I knew a couple of people who had went away and they did CodeClan, and they had been sucked straight into a job because it was that crazy time of 2020, 2021, where companies were seeming to be hoovering up developers. So I saw everybody doing that, and I was like, oh, coding. I like the idea of that. That sounds pretty cool. I didn't immediately jump to CodeClan. I didn't even jump to coding. I started using those no-code, low-code platforms, which are incredibly unsustainable, but we can touch on that later. And there was a company called the Momentum Group in Australia that I worked for a year, using one of their drag and drop platforms, but building out APIs. As weirdly as that is, these drag and drop tools are crazy nowadays. And then there was a jump from there to working at BGSS, and that jump, if I hover over them a little bit, is CodeClan. I did CodeClan, G34, and and in that time, I started at round about that time looking into sustainability from a developer perspective. I remember reading a couple of books, which I'll share at the end for you. And just started to sort of look into it and build out my personal projects with a little bit in mind of how can I make this green? How can I do this from a sort of more, not ethical, I call it what you want, just from a more sustainable perspective, right? Which, funnily enough, I've found in my time that not many, maybe I'm not saying I'm special, but not many developers tend to go from that sort of sustainable approach, or they might pick a certain area like accessibility and really dive in on that, which is great. And I guess my area was sustainability. I currently work at BGSS, which is a tech consultancy. They have offices in every UK city, it seems, some in Portugal. They work for clients like Specsavers, NHS, DVSA, stuff like that. But they're not very well known in the ecosystem, I found. And I went through a thing called the BGSS Academy, which covered loads of different things, which gave me a really interesting sort of initial perspective on the industry. And I want to point that out because I'm not a senior software engineer. I'm probably in that junior area. So I don't know what they've done letting me talk to you guys. No, I'm only kidding. But it's allowed me to sort of see the last 2-3 years of the industry and sort of see how that's starting to move a bit more to be more sustainable. There's new APIs that are coming out that can track the carbon generated on every page load and things like that maybe weren't around 3 or 4 years ago, which again, we'll talk about. So let me zoom out a little bit and touch on this lovely page that I have built to show you my incredible developer skills. If you go and look at the code, it's literally just a single p tag that says hello HTML page. And I did this for a reason. And I'm joking, by the way. I've built other things other than this, but this is the one I'm most proudest of, okay? What I wanted to do is test a couple of different things with very basic, like, hello world pages. So can I track the carbon from this page? And it turns out, yes, I can, and I'll touch on that in a couple of minutes. And how can I basically try and work out what the carbon emission is of any web page if I start to add in custom fonts or images or videos or anything else? How does that start to build up the carbon emissions or the efficiency, the performance? I'm sure this is stuff that many folk in here have looked at from more of the performance side, maybe even the sustainable side. And I'd be happy to chat to you afterwards because I'm very interested in this sort of stuff. But it started off with this. Yeah, so I've also got a similar one with a little picture of a dog, which we'll touch on. A couple of things before I get into it that I want to, I first started to look into, and that was what tools can I deploy this on if I'm building a website? So a good example, more so than the HTML page, was a personal project that I worked on for most of the time I was job hunting. And handily, it's like a job application tracker. So if you've ever used Notion or Excel to keep a track of all the jobs you were applying for, I built a little tool that can do that. And I built it, I think, in Next.js and hosted it on Vercel initially. And then I was like, okay, I want to make this sustainable. I'll just do a Google, find out the green sustainable versions of Vercel, and I'll just crack away with it, right? Turns out that's really difficult. I couldn't find any information online initially when I searched about any tools out there that like host websites on fully green data centers, or I didn't even really find any sort of benchmarking tools to see the different web frameworks. Like I could have just done HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, or React, or SvelteKit, or something like this. But which one do I choose, right? It's that dilemma of being a junior dev and trying to build a personal project and just not even knowing where to start. Plus, I was giving myself that extra rule of try and be sustainable about it, right? So this was the first site that I sort of built with that in mind. And like I was talking about like an ethical job board and stuff like that. And it's still running if you want to play with it, is planetcareer.co.uk, if you like. But that leads me back to my own research into this. I decided to look at all the web frameworks that I could find. And that's why I'm talking about this at GlasgowJS. Because I really did do my best to put a table together. And you can see on the left-hand side, and I'll talk about the numbers, don't worry too much about the numbers just yet, but of each of the frameworks, I guess apart from HTML, that's the one you saw. But we've got Astro, Solid, Quick. These are lesser used frameworks, I suppose. React, the CRA is with Create React App. And then I've also done another one a little bit further down with Vite. Then we have Vue, SvelteKit, Angular, Next.js, and Remix. So I think it's 11. And I tracked a bunch of different things on this. So I tracked the CO2 per visit, the grams of carbon. That's like what it's called in the industry. It's carbon dioxide, blah, blah, blah. But the grams of carbon emitted per visit on that page. And I can talk in a little second about how I did that. The resources on page load, the page weight, the average loading time. I just did some of those with the developer tools, just in the network tab and refreshing and getting the values. An eco-grader score, which I'll talk about, and then the link. And I'm sharing it here, and I'm going to be able to compare these in a second. But this is available on a website, which I'll share at the end. So you can dive into it if you like. You can retest it and prove me wrong on stuff. Feel free. I don't claim to be a data scientist or anything. I just wanted to track all these numbers and try and put something together, which resulted in this. So this is my little graph of all those table data things plugged together. So the EcoGrader score for that basic HTML page that you saw at the start is literally 100 out of 100. Happy days. The tool that I used is this site here. It's called ecograder.com. It's a bit small there, but it literally just is ecograder.com. You throw the URL into there, and it sort of acts like a lighthouse score. It does a lighthouse score first, and then it compares the URL to a massive data set of like hosted websites and compares them and says, yes, this website is hosted on green energy. I'm not actually going to demo it just now, unfortunately, because it takes 5 minutes to run, it feels like, and I don't have enough time for that. Maybe I should have planned that in advance. Next time. But you run it, and it gives you a big breakdown, and it tells you the grams of carbon emitted per page, which is great. That's the sort of thing I was looking for initially, and I could use. So that's what I've done in my app, if I jump back to it. So the EcoGrader score gives it a ranking out of 100. Then it tells me the average page load in milliseconds, which for HTML is 54.2 milliseconds. The page weight is 0.46 kilobytes. I'd hope so, because it literally just is a H1 tag. And in terms of resources, if I hover over that side, it's like 0.46 kilobytes of data. Okay. Now, to show a kind of dramatic difference, I'll jump all the way down to Next.js, and you see that data shift dramatically. All of a sudden, the resources jump up to 317 kilobytes, which if you think about it, isn't next level crazy, right? But I want to point out, if I jump back to my table and go to the Next.js one and click on the link, it's the same thing. It's not, there's nothing else on the page. It's still, I tracked all of these just with a H1 tag. So the extra resources, the extra kilobytes, the extra page load is happening because I guess Next.js is loading a bunch of packages more so than HTML, which is loading 0. So in my head, it's quite interesting. So I can go through each of them in turn, and I'm focusing on this graph rather than the big table, hopefully for obvious reasons, but I think it would be very boring if I spent the next 5 minutes pointing at numbers. So the graph kind of shows us HTML. Has anyone played with Astro? You can nod or shake your head. I know Jamie did something a wee while back with Astro. It's really nice for like static websites, but also does server-side rendering and stuff as well. If I click on that, would you expect it to dramatically shift like Next.js did, or like stay kind of close to HTML? If you know Astro, you might be able to guess. If you don't worry about it. If I switch to Astro, it stays pretty much the same, which was very surprising to me. I really thought all of them were going to be very different from HTML. But interestingly, you might have seen it, Astro actually has a shorter page load than a single H1 tag. So Astro, where you're installing some packages, it must be doing some performance stuff as well to make it a bit faster. If I jump down to Solid, it's pretty much the same, but it seems to load a little bit slower, a little bit more resources. Go down to Quick. It goes almost back to the HTML, so Quick is also quite a efficient, a performant framework. It depends on what you want to call it, but it's getting very similar rankings to a basic HTML website, which is what I wanted to do the comparison between. Create React App jumps away again. I'll actually jump down to Vite just to compare those two. They're almost identical, which is actually quite perhaps interesting, perhaps not. If you know all the absolute in-depth details about those, you might be able to tell me why. Please do. SvelteKit is actually personally one of my favorites in terms of a web framework to use, which is why I wanted to like do this in the first place, actually. So it's still pretty good, but it does have more resource-intensive stuff than maybe, I think, Quick, Solid, etc. And then what ones haven't I done? Vue, that's actually surprisingly good as well. Angular gets away. Next.js gets actually away as well, but it actually has a faster load than Angular. And Remix is about the same as Next.js. So if you would like, in your own time, you can play around with this and mess about with it. I don't have enough time to go into crazy detail and get nerdy about the numbers, but I highly recommend you do if you like. And again, I must say, this all started because I couldn't find any benchmarking tools out there to measure these numbers. So I've tried to make my own. And if any of you are super senior software engineers, you'd be like, this is probably really bad he could have done this totally different, totally fair. I've just been messing around with it and trying to find the numbers for myself. But that leads me on to my next thing, which is this graph. Hopefully everybody can see the graph. This is a very simple graph. This is a comparison directly between those 2 pages I showed you initially. The HTML hello world, basically, and the one with the image. There is no differences. It is literally just I'm adding an image element and just throwing that image in there. And I'm deploying it on Cloudflare, by the way. I'll talk about that later, but every single one of these sites was deployed on the same thing, tested on the same Wi-Fi network with the same approach. I'll talk about that in a second. So it's the same bits at the bottom. So the CO2 per visit, it's the HTML page, so it's 0, which is quite good. Resources is very low, 0.46. Without the image, the page weight is 0.9 kilobytes. Average load time is at 54, and it has a full eco-grader score. If I toggle on this little toggle, you'd expect with an image that you're going to get like another bar that's going to be a little bit higher than the others. And it's quite interesting to see, in my opinion. If I click that on, the average loading time jumps. It goes from 54 milliseconds to 142 milliseconds just from adding a single image on the website. The eco-grader score goes down by 4 points. The page weight goes from 0.9 kilobytes up to 32 kilobytes, which again is tiny in the grand scheme of things. But what I'm trying to emphasize here is that if you're building a website and you're not really thinking about it and you just throw on tons of images, your page weight is going to go up by crazy, and therefore the sustainability of the website, that sort of overall rating for sustainability, is naturally going to go down. And it's something that's probably intrinsically understandable, but I'm just trying to show it with some data that I've put together, basically. There's other things like that. If you load a custom font, that can totally change it. Images, videos, all those different things can have massive performance gains, performance deficits, SEO deficits, like these sorts of things can be affected, but also it will affect your sustainability rating as well. So yeah, the numbers that I found, I've just been sort of playing around with and messing about with, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of an idea of those sorts of comparisons that you can make if you're making a little personal project. And that's the way I sort of approached it. Was I'm building personal projects all the time, it feels like. I really enjoy doing it anyway. How can I make them more sustainable? And it comes down to, I guess, if I'm summing that up, it's using less images. That's always good. Being a bit more mindful about how much JavaScript I'm loading, which framework I choose to use. And yeah, just being a bit more like using these tools like EcoGrader, Lighthouse, you can definitely use, even though it doesn't specifically get the sustainability values, it'll give you a good idea. If you're bored, you can go onto the, I've just connected to an API which tells you if your website's green or not. I don't think I have time today, but it's quite fun typing in like BBC News and stuff and seeing that some of them are definitely not hosted green. Try it with your company's website if you wish, it's up to you. But I won't play around with that just now, it's just there if you want it. The actual one that I'm using is, I think it's called the Green Web Check, Green Web Foundation. It's basically the exact same thing as that, but I plugged it into my own website there. And then yeah, so a couple of resources. If you're interested in this stuff, like I am, maybe I've shown that tonight, maybe not. There's a really interesting book that I read called Sustainable Web Design in 20 Lessons. It goes through all these different things like adding a single image to the website versus optimizing your images and adding to the website, the comparisons there. And probably down the line, I'll do that myself. I'll actually test those same numbers with optimized images and all that sort of thing, but I just haven't got to it yet. That second one, that training, if you're in a position where your company lets you like do training, like AWS courses or Azure AZ900 and stuff like that, that's a really cool one. It's free, but it gives you a really nice like understanding of like demand shifting and a lot of other more in-depth areas, maybe at a more enterprise level, how to bring down those carbon emissions as a company with your data centers, etc. It's the Green Software Foundation that runs that, which is like a subset of the Linux Foundation, if that's interesting. The Carbon Checker, that Green Web Foundation I already talked about. The green pages is a really interesting like resource list of green websites. There's one near the top that's a website that fully runs on a solar panel, so it's sometimes down, which is really cool. I absolutely love that sort of thing, to be honest. And then a couple of green hosting options. Cloudflare Pages, if anyone hasn't played with Cloudflare Pages, it's so fun, it's really cool. Perfect for like statically generated static rendering for personal projects or like landing pages, etc. It's basically Vercel, but nicer and fully green, which 10 out of 10. If you're building a personal project and you're using Vercel, try out Cloudflare Pages. Or Netlify. Netlify is another great one that can't remember the name right now, but a great talk at Edinburgh JS about Netlify, and it runs on green energy as well. You can check it with the green web check, and DigitalOcean also does. However, I think you have to pay for the minimum plan. There's no like free option, unlike Cloudflare Pages, which all these websites that I've built are running on. I think that's everything I wanted to talk about today. Yeah, that's the actual website link if you want to go to it. If I saw some people taking a picture of the resources, but that'll give you the resources plus the rest of the website to mess about with. But yeah, that has been my little talk. I hope you liked it. If you have any questions, fire away.
Any questions? Thank you so much. Oh, sure.
So yeah, my question was that if we're gonna say green on developing websites, so apart from loading page, so how long is gonna take to page gets loaded? So if we just say on best practices and write the code in a way that doesn't use or blow up the RAM of the user or whatever on the phone or on computer, then we say green, right?
So it's basically one of the things that we noticed by looking through those numbers is that your sustainability rating or being green seems to be directly tied to performance or like your SEO approach to building your website, which is kind of what you're saying there, and entirely agree. I would argue that whilst that's very important, the hosting provider that you choose to use is also incredibly important. And I'm approaching this predominantly from personal websites or personal projects. I'm a junior dev. I'm not going to be talking to people about change your massive company's entire platform to XYZ because I don't have the knowledge for that. But if you're making a personal project, yeah, it's just being it's like being mindful of like your images, what hosting provider you're using, and then if you naturally keep an eye on your performance of the website, your sustainability values in my book will go up. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah? Cool. James had a question up at the front.
I've spoken to you about most of this stuff already, but I was actually more of a request than a question. I was wondering if while we're waiting, answering questions, you could pop in a website to the checker just to check. And I was going to suggest Scottish Technology Club, perhaps.
Okay.
As a
If anyone's curious on the browser I'm using, it's called the Arc browser. I love it. It's so fun. People probably don't care. But there you go. I guess I can quickly throw it into my API one. So it just says that it cannot find any data running on it. So this is a data set. The API that this uses is a massive data set of hosting providers. And when it performs this API check, it basically checks, I guess, the whois or something like that to find out what hosting provider it's using, whether that's AWS or like Netlify or something like that. And they probably all use AWS or something like that at the bottom of the list, but in this case, it hasn't found any data on it. If I was to type in, my own website, kelsiesmurphy.com, it just shows like it's running on Cloudflare, and here's some like supporting documents to prove that Cloudflare actually is running on green energy. It's a really interesting thing.
It's more of like a a suggestion in the sense that the the different numbers that you have when you're loading these different frameworks is essentially because of the fact that they have their own inbuilt data and JS written, so that when you're building or when you're writing code, it makes the whole process easier because React has its own framework for it, Angular has a framework for it. So I feel like if you take like a real use case and then build out a website with all these different frameworks and then compare the data, because that's something we actually use to develop a website, that I might feel like it might be a bit more telling on the actual sustainability of it than when you if you just take like an HTML tag, it's not really like a real use case, right? But then great, for thought, actually. Yeah.
No, I absolutely agree. My next plan for this would be to build out like a basic website with routing and stuff like that and compare that. It's more of a time thing at this stage than anything because I'd love to build out 11 different frameworks of the same website. If anyone knows of a website that's been built in 11 different frameworks, let me know and I will benchmark that and share it with everyone next week. But I haven't found any myself that actually do that. It will be something I'll get to, but this was the next best thing for me, which was just, and I haven't actually opened up this parameters bit, but this is just showing the actual trying to be scientific approach about it. So using PNPM, because it is a bit more performant naturally, using just Hello World, hosting them all on Cloudflare pages, which in itself took several days of just running scripts and then debugging it, etc., because they all deploy slightly differently, of course. Chrome browser with no extensions, no additional scripts added, and then using EcoGrader, Website Carbon Calculator, and DevTools for the other additional ones. But I absolutely agree, it's something I definitely want to do at some point, for sure.
Pretty cool, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Kelsie Murphy. I know you specified that you're talking about personal projects, but from what you've seen so far, do you think it is possible at scale to have a platform that runs green? Are there service providers that run servers that are operated on green energy? Is it a thing? Does it exist?
Absolutely is, yes. From my research, which I will say is limited, if anyone's played around with it, AWS does have regions that are fully running on green energy. Cool. However, I've found that isn't all of them. Mm-hmm. So if you're on EU2, that is running on green energy. They also do use demand shifting as well. So I won't go into the full specifics of it, but demand shifting is basically you'll choose two different locations, like one in Denmark and one in South Carolina in America, and at different times of either year or day, you'll switch between them, and using containerization, that can be quite that can be possible to set up. I was going to say easy, but it's probably not. I'm no DevOps guy. So you'd switch between them, and that means that you can sort of try and get the times when the sun's out in Denmark, and therefore you're getting the solar panels. And then maybe there's a hydroelectric dam that runs at a certain time of year or something in South Carolina, etc. So there's lots of different tools out there. DigitalOcean's another great one that's used by many large companies with droplets, etc. And from what I found, that is completely green, which is really cool. And they talk about it at length in their sustainability bit in the footer of their website. And there's probably more. Google, their own website runs on green energy. So I don't know if that's the case for everybody who hosts their website or something through GCP, etc. But it's becoming more and more prevalent in the industry, which is great. I love that. And hopefully down the line, I'll be able to talk about all the other cool things that are up and coming as I learn more.
Awesome, thank you, Kelsie.
Just when you were talking there, give me a thought. I was just wondering, are there any things you would say are the absolute worst for keeping green, keeping sustainable? In your exploration, in your research, have you discovered anything that you would say, stay away from this, it's causing way more damage than anybody realizes?
Bitcoin mining? I don't know. I mean, yeah, I won't claim to be an expert on any of those areas, but yeah, it's more of a mindfulness thing. It's the exact same as folk who have talked about accessibility, or they've talked about various different things at GlasgowJS. It's just, if you have that little bit in the back of your head of, oh, I'm building a personal website right here, or I'm working for my company and they're suggesting to do X, Y, Z, just, you don't need to have a massive amount of pushback and be like, it needs to be X, Y, Z, but just we're using a lot of images on this website, or we're sending tons of unnecessary emails, which is a big one, and OTP, text messages, like every time you sign into your account, you have to get a text message, etc. It's like grams of carbon every single time you send an email or a text. There's so much to that. I feel like that's a separate talk in itself. But yeah, no specific answer, but there's loads to it. There was a gent in a green cap over there that had a question.
Yeah, thanks very much. So this EcoGrader score, you're talking generally about kind of statically built websites. Like these are, I mean, obviously these are ones that can be rendered kind of server side too. The score, is that to do with the power used by a computer, like a rendering device, so a web browser, or like a CDN, like serving resources, or is it a mixture of both? And if it's a mixture of both, do you know kind of realistically what the kind of balance is? It probably depends on kind of how many people are obviously like looking at the website.
Yes.
But there must be kind of heuristics that exist in terms of kind of, because I would automatically think that hosting was a far bigger kind of energy drain than running on local devices, even aggregated, but I could be wrong.
So that's a great question, a really, really good question. It's something I'm still investigating fully. But so this EcoGrader tool fully just does it like post-build time, essentially. So you visit a website, and it seems to be gathering its data from what I found, and it's not open source, so I can only get so far into it. But it does several checks. So it does a check to the green web directory to check the URL and to see that it's green or not. That's the first thing it does. Then it does a lighthouse test, which it gets a lot of its performance metrics. And it seems to get some from like the networking tools in the browser as well. So like if I like refresh the page, like you've got these statistics plus more. So because it's running after build time, it can say, okay, the page weight is X. It took X amount of seconds to do it. And it uses an API called GlasgowJS, which is really interesting. And again, to your point, I don't think it has any way of going deeper than just the build time loaded rendered website. So it probably can't even tell much about like server-side rendered websites versus not, etc. It's just seeing the HTML output and doing X, Y, Z with it. But CO2JS is actually quite a complex API. It's not the easiest to mess around with, so I'm still digging into it. But it seems that there are calculations you can do. So you have the page weight, you have how long the website takes to load, and you have like defined metrics of how much carbon is emitted per blah, blah, blah. So you can basically create that and find out a number and then create a rating from 0 to 100 based on how good that number is, etc. So it looks like that's the approach that they've taken for this. One thing I have found is that there's no standardized system for this. There's no open API. There's no governance over like trying to be sustainable. So the best people that I've found for this are these folks that do EcoGrader and the Green Web Foundation, which are in my resources, but they're trying really hard to get this standardized and having trouble with it, it sounds like, so far. Maybe that'll change in upcoming years. But I know that doesn't fully answer your question, but that's the most I've been able to find with it. The last point that you mentioned, no, it was just on the CDNs, like if you're caching websites, that's obviously another benefit to being sustainable. So if you can use Cloudflare or one of these tools that does caching, that's another bonus. And I didn't really mention that before, so thank you. Any questions from home? No, Mulligan.
Okay, thank you so much. Now I would like to invite Victoria to speak on the mentorship.
Thank you, Kelsie. Just a quick one from me about the whiteboard that some of you may have seen outside in the foyer. I'm once again terrorizing you all with my whiteboard content, but this time it is a bit more exciting. It's because we're launching a Glasgow and Edinburgh.js combined mentorship program, which sounds quite formalized, it sounds quite high commitment, but basically what we're looking for is just a nice way to get all you guys talking with each other. We figure everyone who has a tech question or like an area that they want to improve upon, whether that's career changes, back end, front end, green energy, big data, all of these things, there will be someone here who can help you with that. It's just the problem is finding out who that is and how to talk to them. So in the spirit of that, what we're going to do is set up a page on the website with little bios of people who volunteer for these kind of conversations, the kind of areas that they'd want to be open to talking with people about, and then some way of getting in touch. What we're doing at the moment is either you can share with us an open calendar link. It gets away a lot of the administrative stuff. People can just book with you directly, or you can have it so that people will reach out to us and we'll reach out to you sort of a bit more privately and discreetly. So if you don't want your stuff plastered online, there's an option for that. But we kind of want to keep it very casual, very ad hoc. If you want to build it out into something a bit more long-term with people who get in touch with you, that's entirely up to you. But we just want to find some way of centralizing a way to get these conversations started. So if you're interested in volunteering to be a mentor, that's what that board is for. So drop your email, drop your name, the kind of areas that you'd want to have conversations with people about, and we'll just reach out to you with answers to your questions or a bit more information about the kind of stuff that we'd be looking for. So if anyone's interested, please do sign up. I think it will be very fun. We have some people already from the Edinburgh group. And thank you to our speakers for tonight. I'll hand back over.
Thank you. So next is we have a raffle for a free ticket for .js conference in Paris in June. Visit GlasgowJS.com for details of how to enter in that raffle draw. That's a win-win because if you participate, you might get a ticket to Paris. And on GlasgowJS.com, you will also find to the social media. We would love to shout out about the Glasgow and Scotland as a great place for JS developers. Like, if you are interested more in going into the developing, you can join us there. And please return to, like, it is done. And as Victoria informed about the mentoring scheme, and we have community night happening on 14th of May. And if you would like to be a part of it and you want to go for a 5-minute short talk, you can be a part of that. You can create a code or you can create a slide or presentation and you can show us your portfolio over there. And you can fill a form on the Scottish Technology website for that. The meetup will be announced soon for that. And you can turn into the Edinburgh JS live stream on next Tuesday, 23rd of April for details on the next meetup. Thank you.